Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of ClueCon Weekly. Today, I am very excited to reintroduce Gerry Christensen. Gerry, welcome back to the show. I know we had you on a couple weeks back, but Gerry is the head of partnership and regulatory compliance at Call ID Reputation. And I know we had you on a couple weeks ago, but we just had so much to talk about. So I appreciate you coming back on to continue the conversation because we had a lot of fun last time. So Gerry, welcome to the show again.
Oh, thanks for having me back, John. I really appreciate it. And by the way, it's Gerry, and that's a common thing. Don't worry about it. Gerry with
Gerry,
a G.
my
Yeah,
apologies.
no problem. That way your listeners won't perpetuate that, and don't worry about it at all. But I'm very happy to be back and looking forward to our discussion.
Awesome. So what's been going on? Since we last spoke. I know before we had a lot of good discussions about callers, the reputation about the business, kind of how that leads down to kind of the consumer. But there were also some things that we didn't really talk about. One specifically is kind of caller ID reputation. So kind of what is it that you do, and kind of what has caller ID reputation kind of been doing in order to solve the issue out in the industry?
Well, I think we touched on that a little bit the last time, but it certainly bears repeating or reinforcement. And also, I think we can use it as a good segue to get into some other areas, things that we support in some cases directly and in some cases indirectly. So, Caller ID Reputation Inc. as a company, we have a SaaS-based platform that we offer directly to businesses as well as to companies that are in the communication service provider ecosystem, so that they can have visibility into how their calls are displayed to consumers when they go across the networks. In other words, they can see if they come across as normal, if they don't come across at all, which might mean if they go onto the SaaS-based platform, they might see nothing, or if they have some kind of a flag like a spam label or a scam or something like that. Sometimes those are merited, those flags, by the way, because sometimes in our case, it's highly unlikely we've been outright scammed because the bad guys fly under the radar. They don't want to register their telephone numbers with somebody like us that's, being on the up and up. But it is possible that they could potentially run afoul with some of the regulations like the Federal Trade Commission's telemarketing sales rule or TCPA or something like that. Sometimes just due to crowdsourced feedback, people just don't like getting these kind of calls, and that can get you a spam label. But in any event, what we do with the SaaS-based platform, it's web-based. People can log in. They can see if they're getting these flags. We also provide them a pathway to fix those. We refer to that as remediation. They can do that on either a DIY approach where they reach out to the analytics engines, which would be First Orion, High-End TNS, and that's for T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon respectively. Or they could use our managed service where we do it on their behalf. In many cases, we fix those before they're even aware that there's a problem. But the segue there, though, is there's other things that we do in addition to what I just described to you that support other very important parts of the ecosystem. One of those is branded calling. And I was hoping that we could delve into that a little bit more today,
Yeah,
as
definitely.
well as how that fits into the broader user experience UX ecosystem and some of the other aspects that are important there, if that works for you.
Yeah, definitely. So what kind of is branded calling, and what effect does that kind of have on the customer experience?
Yeah, and first of all, at that high level, UX or user experience, as most of us know it, as it pertains to, I'm going to try to very narrowly define this because UX is this very broad thing that could mean many things. But when I'm speaking in these terms, I'm talking about as it pertains to consumer contact over the voice channel. So I'm trying to constrain it a little bit. There's a few things that are really important there. Now, one of them is the UI, and we're going to get into that in a minute here as it pertains to branded calling. But there's other things as well. There's authenticating and validating calls. There's know your customer, or it could be know your customer's customer. And I think, as I might have mentioned the last time we spoke, KYX, really, where X could be anything or everything, because it could be know your traffic, know your routes. It could be a lot of things. But the important thing here with KYC or KYX is that it's not only the upfront vetting, like how well do I know John? Do I know all of his information associated with his business? But also the ongoing monitoring, because things can change. And then another thing that's under that UX umbrella, in addition to what I just mentioned, is identity management. And in today's world, we have network, identity, we have telephone identity, but one thing that's really sorely missing is organizational identity. If we have time, we'll get to that. This is something that fits in very well with branded calling, actually. And then the last thing, and you sort of started off with asking me what's new. Well, the big thing that's new coming January 27th, unless something changes, is the FCC order that pertains to consent management. So consent management is another thing that is really important under the UX umbrella. And consent management as it pertains to that FCC order is mainly for telemarketers, telesales. They need to have express written consent on a one-to-one basis starting January 27th for any lists that they buy. But before we get into any of those other things, I'm not even sure if we'll have time to get to those other things. Let's pivot back to branded calling, because I think that's the thing that you wanted me to focus on a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I definitely want to talk. Hopefully, we can get around to some of those specifics because, whenever they drop a large law like that, obviously we all have to start complying. A lot of times, they'll throw out these half-baked kind of laws and say, all right, on this deadline we need it, and then they say, oh shoot, actually our infrastructure wasn't set up yet. We'll give you a grace period of like another month. So a lot of times they like to tease us and give us a little heads up when some of that goes along. But it's good at least to know that we're still making fights towards eliminating a lot of the spam that keeps on blowing up our phones. Luckily, election season's over, but holy smokes, that was a really bad time.
It was indeed,
I think everyone.
It was indeed. Unfortunately, I don't get any more of those texts. It was a big sigh of relief, actually. So, yeah, let's get into it a little bit. So, branded calling, again, is a form of user interface UI type of a solution. And if you think about it, if you think about the user interface for telecommunications, specifically at the point in which you need to make a decision about whether you're going to answer a call or not, it has not changed much in literally decades. I mean, the biggest change that occurred, arguably, other than smartphones themselves and a whole new kind of cool looking UI there, is really going all the way back to, I would say, the early 90s, when this thing called Signaling System 7, SS7, came out. And at the time, it was really novel. And it gave us the ability to not only see the telephone number that was calling us, but also, not much long after that was introduced, the ability to relate that telephone number to a name of a party that's calling you. Now, that was a really big deal, because if you think about it, going all the way back then, prior to that, you had no clue who's calling you. You just didn't have any idea. People answered their phones. But what that did is provide a certain ability of call screening. So you could see, for example, as a telemarketer calling, or some strange business, or the name of somebody that could be a wrong number or whatever. And that was certainly helpful. Somewhere in between the 90s and now, and I think it was probably early, I'm going to say 2012, maybe 2013, the scourge of robocalls happened. And all of that value gain that we got there from displaying the name information went away, because not only could we not trust the name information, but also when the name information was absent, people just weren't answering calls. So it's a major, big problem. So fast forward to today, one of the things that we're trying to do at the UI is not throw away calling name, which is otherwise known as CNAM, CNAM. That's kind of the publicly available way of displaying a business name, for example, which, by the way, you do need to make sure that you have the proper business name on there, and that can be spoofed. That's one of the things that the bad guys try to do. They'll try to spoof your number, target the number that's owned by somebody, so it comes across as John Gray LLC, but it's really not. So you need to be cognizant of that. But one thing that is much harder to spoof, and in some cases literally impossible if it's done right, is branded calling. Because branded calling implicitly involves authentication and validation, so that if John Gray LLC gets branded calling set up so that when you call consumers, it shows John Gray LLC, your logo, your reason for call, or whatever it is you want to display, that it really is John Gray LLC and not somebody else. So that's probably the most important point, is that if you're doing branded calling, you never want it to be spoofed. And so there has to be authentication and validation so that we know it's absolutely you. But the net of what it is just simply a new UI experience where you see the logo of John Gray LLC, you see the name of your company, and maybe you've got a DBA. Maybe John Gray LLC is the parent company, and you've got some business that's a doing business as. You might want to show that. You might want to show the reason for call. And the whole point of it is to facilitate greater awareness of who's calling and hopefully greater engagement, because people are more apt to answer the phone. Does that make sense?
So that opens up a really good segue into kind of just how we look at things both from the customer perspective as well as kind of the company perspective, and how it is that we're going about branding some of these calls. I know you talked about authentication and how there can be some different ways compared to SS7. So I was just curious if you could give a little rundown on how it is that this is kind of different in terms of authentication process it is that companies have to go through in order to get this branded calling. And then if you have any experience on how impactful this really kind of is over just the typical CNAM setup that we've seen previously.
Yeah, and let me start off with just a very brief history lesson on this, I guess you could say, just a historical context. And I think I might have mentioned this the last time we spoke as well. With the old school method of signaling, which again is referred to as Signaling System 7 or SS7, back in the day, prior to Voice over Internet Protocol, we had this thing called time division multiplexing, TDM. That was the manner in which calls were transported from point A to point B prior to being packetized VoIP. There were certain disadvantages with that. There wasn't as great a capacity as there is now, and efficiency as there is now. However, one of the advantages was we knew who was calling. So, for example, if I dialed 911, they knew it was my address, my identity, my name. They knew all that information. Today, with these Voice over Internet Protocol, VoIP, one of the main things that's lacking is end-to-end authentication. When they fast-tracked putting it in place roughly 25 years ago, I'm sure somebody will pick that apart and say, Gerry, it was really 30 years ago, but I'm just going to pick that, say 25 years ago. And of course, it evolved quite a bit since then. When it first came out, it wasn't very efficient, but they definitely made lots of improvements from the perspective of creating virtual tunnels and things like that to have greater voice clarity and things like that. The one thing that hasn't changed is there is inherently, implicitly, no end-to-end authentication. And so what that means is John Gray LLC, if you want to get up and running, you could take your laptop and be making calls within minutes after getting set up with a service provider. And what they do is they leverage telecom APIs to be able to plug into the legacy networks to be able to place calls and receive calls and things like that. So that's great from the perspective of efficiency, being able to set things up really quickly, and it kind of democratizes things because it opens it up to all kinds of different players. But you don't know exactly who's calling. So that's why when I mentioned earlier that I'm not going to disparage CNAM. It has a very important role as a identity of last resort, so to speak. So when somebody's placing a call, but you just can't rely on it, because what if somebody's spoofing a telephone number and then it does a lookup? So fast forward to branded calling. The way it works with authentication and validation is one of two ways. There's either a proprietary vendor-specific way of doing it, which is what we see mostly today, or a standards-based way of doing it, and that's being worked on right now. So let's talk about the proprietary way first, because that's most of the branded calls today. So if you want to do branded calling, and what you're going to do typically is you're going to reach out to somebody like First Orion or Newstar or TNS, and that's what you would do to get branded calling on T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon, respectively. You would reach out to them, you'd have a contract with them, and you would give them your credentials. They would vet you. You would give them your logo. You would tell them what you want to say on there as your name, because maybe, like I said, maybe it's a DBA. You would tell them whether or not you want to put the reason for call on there. So one of the things that you would also talk about, hopefully explicitly talk about, is assurances to make sure that those calls are authenticated on the originating side and validated on the terminating side. And that's what's really important and different between branded calling, besides the UI aspects. What's really important and different between branded calling and CNAM, because what they do today is they use a proprietary method that uses out of band signaling. And out of band here means that it follows a different path than the voice itself. They will have an out of band signal that signals from the point of origination to the point of termination that a call has originated. In this case, it's on your behalf, John Gray LLC, so that by the time the call gets to the terminating side and there is a decision as to what to do with that call by the terminating service provider, that signal will provide information so that terminating service provider can decide, should this be allowed to be branded or should it not? And if not, if we think that somebody's trying to spoof this situation, maybe we even put a flag on there. And so that out of band signaling and the ability to mark that that call came from an originating service provider on behalf of some telephone number, which in this example is John Gray LLC, and the ability to signal that specifically with a timestamp. And that's the really important point here is it'll be a timestamp. It could be a second or it could be a half a second or something like that. If there's any variation there that is meaningful, let's say, for example, a call comes through 30 seconds later than what is expected, then it should not receive branded treatment because we cannot, with great confidence, know that that really is a branded call. But if it comes through a second later, or maybe 2 seconds later, or some amount of time that is expected based on call routing, that there could be some delays, then there's a much higher degree of confidence, and typically that call would be branded. So that's the way things are done today. And there's some companies and some solutions that are kind of behind the scenes from those players that I mentioned that are very, very important here, because without that authentication on the originating side and the validation on the terminating side, it would be really, really scary, to be honest, because what if a call comes through that says it's John Gray LLC? It's got the logo, it's got the reason for call, but it's really not. What if it's really a scammer? That'd be really bad.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
No, definitely. And they've definitely done quite some damage in terms of being able to take advantage of some people who, don't understand the system. I know my grandma gets calls all the time saying that I'm locked up in jail or something like that, and she needs money, and she's always wanting to fall for it.
Does
Um,
your grandmother really get
so
those calls
how
saying you're
does
locked up in jail?
Yeah, I know, right? I'm like, Grandma, you
What?
you don't believe? She's like, yeah, it would be him of all the grandkids now. um, but that that brings up a point of just like company reputation, So I know with messaging, we have the campaign registry. Things are kind of tied by EIN and tax ID, and you can kind of pull up a little bit of history there. But how is it that companies are kind of being held accountable, or what, you know, what pieces of evidence are they being kind of judged off of in order to, get this status of branded calling, or, is there a point where maybe it would be taken away having this privilege? I know you talked about some flags, but how is vetting, I guess, and company profile or their reputation kind of held across in branded calling?
Well, we could talk about that in general first, and then we could talk about it with greater specificity as it applies to branded calling. So, in general, KYC is all over the map, and I don't mean that to say that it's not there at all, or that there aren't certain companies that are doing a better job than others, because that certainly is the case. But I would say that there is really little or no uniform standard for KYC, know your customer, meaning little or no standard for how you vet your customers, what kind of questions you ask, what kind of documentation you have as a result of that. And so, John, we see all kinds of crazy things in the industry, both at the service provider level as well as the enterprise level. At the service provider level, there's some, let's say, bad guys out there, gray hats, very dark gray, black hats, that
Hmm.
they do their own DBAs, and they'll do bad stuff. They may even have civil penalties. And guess what they do? They go and do another DBA, sign up with another carrier, and maybe start to do the whole thing over and over again. Now, I'm not
Hmm.
saying that that happens all the time with every carrier, every place, but it happens enough that for folks like myself, we would love to see that stopped. We would love to see it stop before it even happens. And we'd certainly love to see more enforcement beyond just the civil penalties and things like that that's happened already. I think there's been little or no criminal penalties. So, in other words, it's like a criminal enterprise in some cases where there's a form of arbitrage. If
Hmm.
you're an immoral, unethical person and you're making millions of dollars, let's say tens of millions of dollars, and somebody finds you for 1 million, you might be able to negotiate that down because you got a shell company that's an LLC, and maybe you pay a few $100,000, and you go off and you're like smirking because you know that you still made a lot of money, and you didn't go
Hmm.
to jail. So,
Yeah, and do it again.
yep, exactly. But let's distill that down to branded calling. Branded calling, I don't think we're seeing as much of that. And the reason I say that is because it's a much smaller ecosystem, because branded calling has a cost associated with it. Because the bad guys, they do again a form of arbitrage. They pay micro pennies for transit, hoping that they'll have a few calls where they'll steal from a grandmother, very sad stuff that happens, right? But they know that literally billions of calls aren't even answered because they know most of them are blocked. And even those where somebody answers, hopefully most of the time people don't fall for it, right? So what they're hoping for is they get enough hits, and that's why it's a form of arbitrage. But with branded calling, it does not cost micro pennies. It costs pennies, which is orders of magnitude more expensive than the transit costs to move packets from point A to point B, but it's enough of a cost that it prohibits most of the scammers. Now, I'm not going to say it'll prevent all scammers, because that's one of the reasons why I say KYC involves ongoing monitoring, because it's conceivable at some point in the future, even branded calls will have scammers involved with that, besides the obvious spoofing that we talked about earlier. But I would say that that's one reason, that just simply the economics. Another reason is smaller group of companies involved means that you really can focus on those companies and be much more rigorous in terms of your KYC. And I believe at branded calling that is the case. And in fact, the other form of branded calling that we haven't gotten into yet, the standards-based form of branded calling, something that the CTIA organization refers to as BCID, they have their own recommended KYC, which in some cases is above and beyond the KYC that's done ordinarily. And in other cases, it might be less. But in any event, there's kind of at least a CTIA based standard, as it were, for KYC if you're doing a BCID based branded call. And so that I think is a step in the right direction, because the whole idea there is, again, you never want any call that involves branding to be unlawful in any way, shape, or form, let alone an outright scam. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, just finding ways to get these trouble people off of the network. And it's really a toss for providers like us who want to make it really accessible for people to get these tools at their fingertips, yet we make it so accessible for them in order to do these things. And it seems like a lot of the time the accountability was kind of placed on the phone number, and we would see just numbers burning and turning, because if one number gets a bad reputation, that's all right. We have an api and we can go buy 10,000 numbers, and be able to kind of turn that thing around. So the economics of just a couple extra pennies, I really hope does kind of change the scale of some of these abilities in order to do that. Just because we need to find a good standard in order to make people have trust in their phones again. I think
Well, it
that's
does,
kind of
just to clean that up just a little bit. It does change it in terms of not many branded calls. Very, very, very few will be unlawful or outright scams. But we're very early stages in terms of changing having wide scale impact of minimizing scams. One of the things I like to say is that the good will kind of push out the bad. And as that
Hmm.
pertains to branded calls, I think one thing that'll happen at some point, it may be years from now, it could be 5 years from now, people will come to realize that when they see a branded call, first of all, they recognize it for what it is, that it's, oh, this is a call that was branded from a company. This is a real live vetted organization. And they know that they can trust that. If you think about the psychology there, conversely, if a call comes across that does not have branding, it doesn't mean necessarily it's a bad guy, but those are the kind of calls that you won't necessarily answer. But the ones that have branding, you might implicitly answer that, right? So I think
Hmm.
that's when we'll hit the inflection point where there'll be much more branded calls. And I think it'll probably follow the typical supply dynamic, supply demand curve dynamic of most products. Where right now it costs pennies. Maybe at some point branded calls cost micro pennies as well, a tenth of a
Hmm.
penny or hundredth of a penny. Who knows? At some point, once there's scale, because right now we're early days, and shoot, when I was a youngster, a calculator that could only plus minus divide and multiply, that was like $100 or something, and now
Yeah.
it's just like, you know, but so I think at some point we will reach that inflection point. But for now, it just is a pathway towards where we want to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, we kind of got to start somewhere. But I think the ultimate goal of just having a lot more trust in your phone. And as you said, that, implicitly you'll just kind of pick up the call rather than having to see the phone number. I think that's definitely kind of the way that we need to kind of start viewing kind of communications, because your cell phone's something that's pretty personal to you. I kind of get a little romantic in that regard, where it's like an invasion of privacy almost when people have the ability to kind of get a hold of you. But to kind of be able to separate out some of those paths in order to be like, hey, this is, so and so with a company that maybe I don't really care about sending me some ads or trying to, just give me garbage content. They can
Indeed.
be put in one shelf. Maybe some of the bad uh users out there, can hopefully be stopped, put in another realm, and then we can have kind of our branded calling. But I think that just kind of as a society, we're kind of definitely moving kind of towards that direction of a lot more of the kind of an encrypted version of communication. We see that sometimes with some of the different apps that are coming around. I know I was just listening to a Joe Rogan and Mark Zuckerberg conversation about kind of how they're doing messaging and some of the RCS involvements that are kind of coming about. But I think that we're kind of starting to get to a point where we need to have accountability for communication, and I think this is really kind of like the next big step in order to make that happen. In kind of just the realm that we have.
Well, you're definitely preaching to the choir here, and I would assume that most of your listeners, same thing. I mean, hopefully, most of your listeners are striving to be white hats, or at least as
Hmm.
light gray as possible. Commercially reasonable efforts to follow the rules and regulations, and so one thing that's related to this, it's kind of orthogonal. In other words, it's related but independent. Is consent management, and you touched
Yeah.
on it yourself just a moment ago. And I've had personal experiences where there's not been consent, where it's clearly uh, I might have mentioned this to you before. I get a call from somebody offering to relieve me of my timeshare. Well, 20 years ago, I opted in for help there, but I haven't owned a timeshare in over 20 years now. So
Hmm.
I still get those calls, clearly not consensual.
Yep.
There's this thing called aged leads where, you opt in and they sell it and resell it and resell it. And by the way, that January 27th thing from the FCC, that's intended to stop that type of thing.
Definitely.
There's other instances in which it's just a flat out cold call where there was no consent ever given. I had that happen to me recently as well. I won't say the name of the company, but yeah, I think it involved something to do with investing or helping companies do an exit or something like that. And it seemed to me that I didn't give them consent. Somehow or another, they got my personal cell phone number. And there's probably 20 or 30 different companies out there that, if you want to get somebody's personal cell phone number, you can get it. You just need to pay some
Hmm.
money. They did that. They saw my role on LinkedIn, I think, and thought that I was like the head of the company. and then they call me with a pitch to help me with an exit of the company or something like that, selling
Yeah.
some services. So that's why consent is so important, because I agree with you. It is an invasion of privacy, and it's a waste of my
Hmm.
time, and just downright annoying. So I think that at some point, ideally in real time, what would be conveyed to the consumer at the point of decision where they're deciding whether to answer the call or not, in addition to these other UI types of things we've already talked about, there would be some ability to convey whether consent is there or not. Because if you think about it, John, not everybody's going to want to do branded calling.
Hmm.
Not everybody is going to want to display the name of the company. Perfect example is third-party debt collection. They're never going to want to do that, because let's say you owe a debt, and are you going to answer a call that says Gerry Christensen debt collection?
We
Reason
want your
for my
money?
call
No
is
way.
you deadbeat, you need to pay. No one's going to
Uh-huh.
do that, right? But if you saw a call that came across that had some indication that it was a vetted organization, right? And also that there was consent to call you. And if you owe a debt, you do have consent, because that's the fine print that says they're allowed to call you as long as
Yeah.
they follow. So if you saw that, you probably would answer it. And then you'd be like, oh man, dang it, they're trying to collect this debt. But still, you'd probably answer it, right?
Hmm.
So I'm thinking at some point, above and beyond all the things we've already touched on, the ability to not only properly manage consent, but also to be able to convey that in real time to a consumer so that they can make a decision whether to answer a call or not. I think that that's going to be really important. We'll see how that plays out.
Hmm. No, and it's not so black and white. And you think, oh, why can't we just have more regulation and add more accountability to some of these things? But I mean, when you look at it and kind of just the actual use in business applications of some of these customers, I mean, telling them to add a checkbox that says I consent, to have you call me, to a company that's three people and none of them are web developers. That's kind of throwing a wrench into some things. Or hey, we don't have a tax ID. We've just been doing this, for so and so reason, and maybe there isn't money, directly tied to it, but it's a really important thing that sends me a call when the water pipe has bursted, little things like that, where it's like, it's not so easily cookie cutter in terms of adding some of these regulations. And I think that's probably why we have a couple of deadlines pushed back a little bit. But I kind of wanted to just briefly touch on the consent management and kind of the new regulations that are coming across before I do let you go. So kind of how do you think that this will be different from the current messaging kind of opt-ins, and how it is that we're gathering that? I know in some cases we have like verbal consent. Sometimes you need written consent. As you mentioned with debt collection, sometimes it's in that fine print of some agreements that you have. But do you feel as though it's going to be kind of similar in that way, or do you think that calls and messaging kind of have their own little realms in the telecommunication space?
Well, if I understand correctly, both in the text world as well as the voice world, you need to have consent for both, with some exceptions. We talked about some of them earlier, like those political ones, and the problem with the political ones is you don't know whether they're legit or not. And so even though I could say STOP to stop it, if it's
Hmm.
legitimate, great. But I'm always concerned, like, what if it's not legitimate? Then I just let them know that there's a real human being here. So of course I don't do that, and then they never stop. That's the irony of it.
Exactly.
But the thing that's going to be different with this order that takes effect, unless it changes between now and January 27th, is, and this mainly impacts telemarketing and telesales, because they are the ones that buy lists. And when you buy a
Hmm.
list, what that means is they're not an existing customer. It's kind of different if you have what they call an EBR, an existing business relationship. Because if you have an EBR, most likely there's already fine print somewhere in something that you signed, like if you're a bank customer, for example, that says they're allowed to contact you under certain circumstances, or maybe carte blanche. An example would be if they need to call you with a fraud alert. And this happened to me. I tried to use my debit card in a grocery store, and sure enough, they called me, and they had the right to do that because I'm a
Hmm.
customer, and fine print said they could do that. By the way, some folks think that just because you have an EBR, that in all cases you can be contacted with offers like a commercial offer. That is not the case. Just because you have a business relationship with somebody doesn't mean that they can just call you and offer you some new service or something. Now, if they're calling you about your existing thing, like, oh, there's a truck that's coming to do something for you and it broke down, so it's going to be delayed, that's different. Because that's a service that you asked for and there's an implied relationship there. Well, let's bring this back around to that order for January 27th. So telemarketers, telesales that buy lists, the wild, wild west used to be you go to a website, you fill out a form, you say you're interested in XYZ. You don't read the fine print. All of a sudden, not only are you getting contacted about XYZ, you're getting contacted about ABC and alpha, beta, gamma, and all sorts of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're also getting contacted from all these different companies that was not the initial company that was really obvious to you on the form, because fine print, you can be contacted by a bunch. So this is the so-called telemarketer's loophole that this order is supposed to take care of. The express written consent on a one-to-one basis is supposed to make it really obvious who's going to contact you and what they're going to contact you about. So that way, going forward, when a telemarketer is using their lists, they have to comply with this rule. And if they don't, then there could be some problems. Now, how this may be enforced or how much of a difference this is going to have on telemarketing come January 27th, that's anybody's guess. And I've asked some people, I said, what do you think is going to happen from an enforcement perspective here? And there's lots of opinions out there, but who knows? I personally, I think it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't mean that all of a sudden things are going to change dramatically, because there are still some telemarketers out there that are just ignoring it. There's other ones that say that they're starting to comply with it already, and so kudos to them. But again, I think it's a step in the right direction. If we've learned anything at all in the last 5 to 10 years about dealing with this kind of stuff, it's that you need to make steps in the positive direction. You can't just say, oh, stir shaken's going to solve world hunger and all of a sudden everything's okay, because it doesn't work that way. It just doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know I keep relaying this back to messaging, but I guess it's really the only thing that I've experienced and kind of seen just drastically change over the course of just a couple of years. But for instance, use cases that they have, when they first dropped, it was like your political, your marketing, or your sending 2FA. But now we have just this huge list of different use cases, based on how much traffic it is that someone's sending, how risky it is that they might be, throttling the throughput kind of some of these brands. And then we can really see how it is that companies are being vetted, how their reputation is being monitored, and how it is that they can kind of grow based off of good actions. And the bad players have definitely fallen into some of those spam blocks. Just lastly, quick note on some of the consent with calling. I've kind of seen this become a little bit of an issue in terms of AI development. A lot of customers who want to utilize AI is kind of, hey, we want to go through this list of 500 customers. We want to see which ones are actually interested in this new product that maybe we have coming out. So we want to kind of spam and hit all those, but it's still definitely a gray area in terms of robocalls, who it is that's calling that, both the content of the call as well as how it is that they're reaching you. I think we have a lot of moving targets, and kind of what you were saying, we kind of have to just make a couple steps. I'm sure they're going to make a couple of mistakes along the way. There will be some hurdles, some very upset, angry customers. But at the end of the day, at least there are a lot of good benefits that are coming out of this. And for most customers and most use cases, it doesn't seem as though this can really negatively impact them in a lot of ways. A lot of this is really just going to be able to boost the reputation and kind of the experience for both the customer and the company. So I just wonder if you had any other last points on kind of the scope, where we're kind of headed in the near future. If you have any predictions on what this will look like in case we want to go place some bets or win the lottery on that. But how is it that customers can kind of utilize either call ID reputation services, and kind of where do you see the landscape kind of evolving in the near future here?
So for the near future, again, I think the biggest thing is going to be this consent management type ruling. And so I think there's going to continue to be a lot of discussion about it, whether any meaningful impact happens, meaning that there's fewer calls like the ones that I just described that I experienced personally. Who knows? But I think we're going to continue talking about that. I think this is going to be a big year for branded calling because there's so much momentum behind it. And I think that is going to cause people to have a broader discussion about this trust framework that I mentioned. And again, that trust framework is branded calling as a form of UI. That's just one part of UX. And UX is really this broader umbrella that includes UI, authentication validation, KYC, which is vetting plus monitoring, identity management. And again, we've got some of that already. With Stir Shaken, we've got telephone number and network, which is cool.
Hmm.
But we're missing this thing called organizational identity, which is the ability to track and have traceability of John Gray LLC, for example, and him taking, or that entity, I should say, taking responsibility for calls. That's something that I'm a big proponent of. There's others that are proponents of that as well. And then finally, I would say consent management is part of that umbrella. So we need, as an industry, to make great strides in all of those areas, not just one. We can work to optimize just one of those as a silo, but I would argue that doing that, we're really missing the boat. We need to work on all of those to make things better. And I think that in the near term, we're going to chip away at the armor, but
Hmm.
it's a constant struggle between, wanting to not reduce commerce in the sense that, carriers want to make money, right?
Yep.
They
So
get
do we.
paid. They get paid to make calls. They get paid to
Hmm.
transit calls, right? And to a certain extent, it's like, yeah, nobody wants grandmothers to lose their money. I certainly don't want that. Nobody wants that. That's a moral person, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's no one wants to make it so bad, so difficult that companies go out of business. I think longer term, though, that there's going to have to be consolidation in the industry. And it's not just because Gerry Christensen wants that, or I'm throwing a dart on the board. I think it's going to be just the basic economics. And by
Hmm.
that, I mean, currently, if it costs micro pennies to transit a call, and if we're going in a direction where it's going to cost more for a legitimate business to place calls, branded calling, perfect example of that, then there's going to be a need to consolidate because you're not going to have so many players out there because they're going to have to raise their prices, and there's all kinds of prices that are going to be raised too, because one thing we didn't even talk about is least cost routing. There's some companies that out there that exist just to get a call from point A to point B, and they don't have a clue in some cases or don't even care what the call is. They're just moving packets. And so when the cost of a call goes up, and if there's a great desire to have all IP networks, that is going to squeeze out some of these players. And right now, there's literally thousands of intermediate network operators. There's going to be consolidation there. So we're talking a much longer period of time here, over the period of say 5 years. There's not going to be thousands of them. It just doesn't make sense because the costs are going to go up. But the
Hmm.
revenues are also going to go up on a per customer basis too, because there's going to be a greater willingness to pay for legitimate law abiding businesses. And that's the proviso there. Legitimate law abiding businesses will be willing to pay more because their calls will actually be answered. But the ones that are flying under the radar, the bad guys, the black hats, the dark gray market, they'll get squeezed out because they can't do their arbitrage. And that'll have an impact on, again, the number of carriers, because you won't need to have so many carriers sending billions of calls anymore, because there just won't be as many. Does that make sense?
Exactly. No, definitely. And you've got me fired up over here. Because it's not very profitable to stop spammers, as you were kind of mentioning. Both stopping your own customers as well as kind of putting efforts in, for whether we have government entities, that are going in and kind of taking over. It's taxing on all of us, and then ultimately the weight sometimes has to be carried on the good players instead of all the bad ones. But you've got my hopes up. I'm pretty optimistic about the new landscape of calling, definitely from our conversations. Is there any other remarks you want to close out? I know I've stolen quite a bit of your time today. I know we can talk about ID, reputation, customer experience, logistics, and how much we hate spammers literally all day. But any other remarks that you wanted to cover before we wrap this thing up today?
I don't think so, other than to say we've got some events coming up that then and typically I attend things like IT Expo and Enterprise Connect and Cloud
Hmm.
Connections 2025. And so February, March, and April, respectively, I'll be at those events. I'm going to be speaking at all three of those. So if
Awesome.
anybody's going to be going to those events, I'd be happy to meet with them in person. And John, thanks for the opportunity to be part of
Yeah,
this.
I appreciate having you. Signal Wire Free Switch will also be at IT Expo, so I just booked my flight last night actually. So I'll be seeing you over there. I'll be sure to see your talk. And
Yeah,
as always, great conversation. Thank you for lightening our community on the new landscape of branded calling and just calling in general.
thanks, John.